Shalom and welcome to Simchat Yisrael. One of the things I always enjoy about the weekly Parsha is trying to figure out what the sages were thinking when they paired the Torah and the Haftorah portions together. On some weeks, the connections are obvious, but on others, the relationship is more complex. This week's pairing of the stories of Pinchas and Elijah the prophet at first glance seems to be of the latter sort. On the one hand, we have a rather lurid tale of spiritual and sexual indiscretion punished swiftly and violently at the hands of a hot-blooded avenger. On the other, we have an intimate look at the relationship between God and Elijah, while the prophet is alone, on the run, and in fear for his life. What could these two very different stories have in common? Before we get into the Parsha, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel down below. A closer reading reveals that these two stories share many parallels. The nation of Israel was engaging in idolatry at both times, seduced by the Moabite woman in Pinchas' case, and having abandoned God in favor of Baal in Elijah's. Both stories see a purge of the idolaters, a return to the worship of God, and a transfer of authority from Moses to Joshua in Parsha Pinchas, and from Elijah to Elisha in 1 Kings. But perhaps the most profound connection between these two stories is that Pinchas and Elijah are the only two figures in the Tanakh who are described as zealots. Jewish tradition makes much of this connection, and the two men share much in common. They were both religious heroes, men who took a stand at times when Israel was in a state of terrible moral crisis. Both men acted boldly, while everyone else just watched the nation fall into sin. And both men acted not for their own sake, but to defend the honor of God and ensure the welfare of the Jewish nation. To be zealous for the Lord must be a wonderful thing, perhaps, but perhaps not. What exactly is zeal? Almost every English translation of the Bible translates the single word kana into three separate ideas: envy, jealousy, and zeal. Envy is the covetous desire for something that belongs to someone else and is almost always a destructive emotion. Jealousy is the feeling of insecurity and anxiety over the anticipated loss of something that belongs to you. While this is still a negative emotion, it's often justified and righteous. Zeal, in the biblical sense, means to be jealous on God's behalf. The zealot, in effect, is taking action in the place of God, and this is always a slippery slope. Take, for example, the two men featured in this week's Parsha. While Pinchas and Elijah acted with righteous zeal, God's treatment of them following their acts of zeal suggests that his feelings towards zealotry are somewhat ambivalent. God immediately makes a covenant of peace with Pinchas and grants his descendants a covenant of everlasting priesthood. But Pinchas already came from a line of everlasting priests. His father was Aaron, the former high priest, and his father was Eleazar, the current high priest. Pinchas was already in line to be the next high priest, and his sons after him. Why would God need to reestablish this covenant and add a new covenant of peace to the bargain? One need only look at the example of King David to know that the shedding of human blood is incompatible with serving God in the temple. God told David, "You have shed much blood and have waged great wars. You shall not build a house to my name, because you have shed so much blood on the earth before me." God seems to be doing damage control for Pinchas. He makes a covenant of peace with him, similar to the promise of rest and peace he makes to David's son Solomon, promising that Pinchas will never have to repeat his violent act. God has to reestablish Pinchas' eligibility for temple service and reaffirm the priestly line that was nearly severed by Pinchas' act of zeal. Likewise, God feels the need to teach Elijah a lesson after his showdown with the prophets of Baal. In the aftermath of that violent confrontation, Elijah is forced to flee from the wrath of Queen Jezebel into the desert, where God speaks to him at Mount Horeb. When God asks Elijah why he's a fugitive, Elijah responds that it's because he's been very zealous for the Lord. He acted on God's behalf and defeated the false prophets and executed them himself. Rather than praise the prophet for defending his honor, God instead shows Elijah a demonstration of the powerful forces of nature. First, a mighty wind, then a raging earthquake, and then a roaring inferno. But God was not in any of those things. Instead, God appears as a still, small voice. God is teaching Elijah that his true face is not found in violent confrontation, great acts of destruction, and the shedding of blood, but in gentleness and words softly spoken. God then tells Elijah to anoint Elisha as his successor. Elijah's work is done, and a new prophet must take his place. Likewise, Pinchas is passed over as Moses' successor in favor of Joshua. Despite being the hero of this week's Parsha, the Torah seems to be telling us something about zealotry. The zealot takes the part of God, But this course of action, while necessary at times, is fraught with danger, and the slightest misjudgment could result in disaster. Pinchas executed a man and a woman without trial or due process. Elijah offered sacrifices to God outside the temple and incited a mob to violence. God may be able to execute perfect judgment, but any man who seeks to mete out justice on his own behalf risks following his own desires and taking the law into his own hands. The zealot has his place in the kingdom of heaven, but that place is not in leadership. A leader must be merciful and compassionate, must have patience, forbearance, and respect for due process. He doesn't have the freedom to act with zeal and righteous fury. Instead, he needs to understand the lesson that God taught Elijah, that God is not found in violence and force, but in the still, small voice that turns men back towards him. Shalom, and thanks for watching. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe, and don't forget to visit simchatyisrael.org to learn more.